I think that that is just really crucial to allow our children to process things like death or feeling unloved or abandonment, all of these things that are really scary to any person. Our kids feel scared about that too, and we have to let them process that in some way. And I think that fairy tales are a fantastic way to do that because they're also built into a worldview that's filled with good conquering evil, which is what we believe if we believe the gospel.
Welcome to Creating Our Holy Home. I'm your host, Jillian Hofer, and I am so excited to be speaking to the Catholic moms, the Catholic wives, the Catholic women who are trying to bring their families to heaven one small intentional thing at a time. I remember when my husband and I had been dating for just a few months early in our relationship, and we were talking about kind of our different wants and dreams for our lives and our philosophies on how we imagined our families living. And my husband actually referenced a book called The Grace of Enough, written by author Haley Stewart. And he said, hey, I really think to understand a little bit about my spirituality, reading this book would be a really great insight. So I read it, and it's an amazing book that Haley wrote about a time in her life where her and her family kind of said okay, God, take what you want from us and we're going to go kind of choose a path of voluntary poverty in order to follow your call. We're going to go live intentionally in a poor part of the town that we are living in. We are going to live very humbly, very frugally. It was a really wonderful book. And it really of course, the title, The Grace of Enough, it's literally just about being content with what God has given you in the moment. I took away from this book the fact that Haley and her family were living at one point with no running water. So they had sawdust toilets. And if you don't know what that is, look it up. I'm not gonna explain it on the air. But that is the one thing I remember. I went to my husband after I read it, and at the time boyfriend, and he was like, what do you think of the book? And I was like, I can't live with no running water. I can't do a sawdust toilet. And he was like, you are missing the point. And I was like, no, I don't think you're hearing me. I can't do a sawdust toilet. He was like, you are missing the plot. That is so not the point. So I just thought that was a funny story to share, that today's guest is Haley Stewart, the author of The Grace of Enough and so many other books. She also is currently the editor of Word on Fire Votive and is the host of the Votive podcast. Like I said, she's the author of The Grace of Enough, Jane Austen's Genius Guide to Life, the Sister Serafina Mysteries, and the Catholic Kids Cookbook, which is coming out soon. You can pre-order. I'll put the link in the show notes. She lives in Florida with her 4 kids. I thought this conversation ended up being so cool and so insightful. Haley's kids are aged elementary through high school, and she obviously is an avid reader, writer. It's her job, literally. And she's raising 4 kids that are avid readers as well. And we ended up having a really cool conversation just about kind of the importance of fostering the love of reading and the desire to read, but also of media literacy and kind of how, as your kids grow, you can start to develop that contextual media literacy with them through the worldview that we hold as Catholics. We get into should you pre-read books before your kids read them? And what kind of books should you have around the house? And how can you make sure that your kids are having these critical kind of discussions and thoughts about the books that they're reading, even if they're not written from a Catholic worldview? And she also gives us a preview of some of the amazing books that she has been working on with Word on Fire and her work there that you can add to your bookshelves at home. So I'm so excited for you to listen to this conversation with Haley Stewart. Haley, thank you so much for joining us on the Creating Our Holy Home podcast.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to it.
I am so excited to have you. I told you a little bit before we had the microphones on that I absolutely am a fan of yours, all of your books. The Grace of Enough was one that was really impactful for me in my own spiritual journey, and I know you've done so much since then. So I'm excited to catch up and kind of hear your journey and what you've been up to leading up to now you're working at Word on Fire, right?
That's right. That's right. So I'm the editor of Word on Fire Votive, which is the children's imprint within Word on Fire's publishing house. So I get to do everything from dream up books that should exist and find the right author and illustrator to exploring different pitches that come in and then working with the text and illustrations and forming it. So I kind of think of myself as a book midwife in that role. Like I
I'm obsessed.
take the baby, but I'm like helping it be born and shared with the world. So it is a lot of fun. And it's also fun as an author to kind of get to see the other side of the process and support authors in that work, and then get to see them be so excited as their book comes out into the world, and knowing just what that feels like because I've been in that same position. So it's just a blast. Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Do you feel like, Haley, that if you told like 12-year-old Haley what your job was today, would she just be geeking out?
I think so, but also I think she would have been surprised because
Really?
at that point, I think I was planning to be Fantine and Les Mis on
Of
Broadway.
course.
And that, I would have needed some time to process, knowing that that didn't pan out for me. I went in a different direction. Um, but yes, I mean, so I'll just share a little bit about my journey to this role. So I really didn't do a lot of writing, or I did a lot of writing in college, but I didn't do writing for leisure or just for my own pleasure until after my oldest child was born. And I was just trying to process all of that, what that transformation into motherhood, and just wrap my mind around it. And so that's when I started to write. And at the same time, I was in the process of converting to Catholicism. And so I was kind of writing through that journey as well. And then I continued just writing on my own, started a blog, and then some people started reading it other than my mom, which was exciting. And so it was kind of just this side thing for a very long time while I was having babies and homeschooling. So I homeschooled for 10 years. And then it was just kind of, I wrote a book, I wrote another book, just different pieces coming together while simultaneously um, educating the kids at home and dealing with pregnancies, just all of these things. So I was kind of self-employed doing everything part-time. And then over time, that kind of shifted to more and more work and more hours. And then just as my oldest was transitioning into regular school, it was just the right time for him to do that, and the best situation for him at that point. It was like this position kind of opened up right at that time. And so it was just fascinating how I didn't, for so much of early motherhood, I really didn't have on my radar, like going back to work full time anytime soon. But then just the stars aligned. And then now I get to do this job that I couldn't even think up a more fun job. It's just like, it's amazing. And I get to work with such incredible people, and it just fulfills all my creative longings and, passion. And also I get to work from home. So I'm like, today, a kid is homesick and she's drinking tea on the couch. And so just being able to do these things kind of simultaneously and watching how they've shifted and balanced over the years. It's just a reminder that there's so many different ways to do things as a parent, and that's going to shift season to season. You don't have to, decide I'm going to be a stay-at-home mom for the next 30 years. Like you can just take it one year at a time, see what's working, see what's not working. There's so many options out there, which is something that I don't feel like as a young mom I had a good sense of. Like I had a rigid sense of like, this is how it should be done. Without that other piece of, actually, there's so many different dynamics. There's so many variables. There's so many personalities and giftings, and you just don't know what that's going to look like in the future. And it's just kind of exciting to get on the train and see where it takes you.
Oh, I love that this is where the conversation is starting, Haley. So I have a 1-year-old daughter. She just turned 1 last week. And I had the same, I don't know if it's, obviously there's a lot of chatter, and there's always kind of opinions, especially within the Catholic space, about like what motherhood looks like and like what you choose as a mother, of like whether you're staying at home or you're working full time. But now there's so much variability. And like you said, I'm so glad you brought up seasonality. It's like there's so many different seasons of motherhood. I think about now how it's like, I'm able to work full time. I've got my daughter, and I have kind of let go of the expectation on myself that, like, okay, since I chose to be a working mom, I am now a working mom, and that's my identity for the rest of my motherhood journey. I've like gone, okay, if 5 years down the road, all of a sudden, we've got 3 kids or whatever situation changes for me and my job or my husband's job or whatever, it's like, that could definitely flex at some point. And it's so freeing to kind of just go, okay, I'm giving literally that to God. I'm giving the situation of my life and my work and my motherhood to God to blend however he wants to.
Absolutely. And I think if there's, one thing that's very true is just that life surprises you, so you might get a kid that isn't the kid you expected, and they're needing
Yes.
more, or you are in an opportunity opens up, or you move, or, just there's all kinds of things that can happen. And it really is good to kind of hold on to it really loosely and just be prepared for the changes. And like you said, that identity shift can be difficult. Like I remember when we were discerning whether or not to stop homeschooling, and there was a little bit of like a loss, a sense of loss there of like, oh, but I've been a homeschooling mom. Like that's been part of my whole thing. And so to lose that felt weird initially. And like I felt very confident that this was the best thing for my son, who was the first one to go to school rather than be homeschooled. But it was still like a weird mental shift for me to kind of just embrace and accept that and not feel like, oh, but homeschooling mom is my thing. I can't change now. That's who I am. And just let it be, no, like I want who I am to be the person who's trying to do what's best for my kids. And if this is the best thing for him now, then I need to release that identity in order to do that. So there's so many things, there's so many voices in our ears as moms, and it helps to kind of release some of that, but it's also like a process. Like I
Yes.
know, like I probably heard people say this to me as a young mom, but it like until you kind of get there, it's just it's that journey. And so you can hear, okay, don't make this so much part of your identity, but maybe you can't do that. Maybe you're going to become the homeschooling mom and it's part of your identity, and then you're going to have to release it. So it's just kind of part of the learning process.
I love that. I always joke that when I get like a new jacket or a new hat or a new set of earrings that I love, I make it my personality for the next 3 months because it's all I wear. And it's just like, oh, I love this, so I'm going to wear it all the time. But it's like, I kind of think of now, or I'm starting to shift my perspective of like, okay, that quote unquote identity, it's just a hat. And that hat can maybe become your personality for a minute, but then like you can take it off and put it in your closet and maybe put it back on later. But like you can still keep it. It can still be around, but you got to switch it up every once in a while. And it's like, if God's telling you, okay, time to put that hat up and let's put a different one on for a while. Also fun. You can make new outfits.
Exactly. It's an adventure. It's an adventure.
It is. Oh my gosh. Okay. So you have 4 kids. Youngest is in elementary, oldest is in high school, correct?
That's right. First grade to 10th grade is the span.
Amazing. So, like you were saying, going back to kind of your journey to how you got to Word on Fire and what you're doing today, you kind of came into this work and maybe even just finding of a gift of like reading and writing and those kind of things. It sounds like parallel in your motherhood journey, like when you were becoming a mom, you were kind of finding these things. So tell me a little bit about in early motherhood and as your kids have grown up, like was reading and kind of having those stories around the house something that became important to you all, or something that your kids were drawn towards because it was your work?
Yeah, so I was always a big reader. I love fiction. I love children's books. I love novels. And so stories have always been really, really important to me. And one of the most fun parts of parenthood to me has been getting to read aloud and like share stories with my kids, stories that I love, because then it builds something beautiful into your family culture when you have kind of this common language to share with your kids where like all these characters and they'll make little references, make little jokes and, oh, this reminds me of such and such. And you're kind of sharing that together. And it's also forming their sense of the world and their sense of where their role is in the world, like who they are in their own story, is really informed by the stories that we share. And so that was definitely a huge piece of motherhood for me, and really the thing that, like, of all the things, that's probably the thing I enjoy the most, is sharing stories with my kids, reading with my kids, and just the conversations that organically emerge about morality, about faith, about human nature. It just naturally comes up where you don't have to flip to the back of the book and be like, here's the discussion questions, for Narnia or whatever. But it's just going to come out where they're going to want to talk about, like, why did Edmund have such a hard time doing the right thing? It seemed easier for the other Pevensey children, or, different things. Like, they just want to wrestle with those things if it's an open conversation with you, and you're open to that, and you kind of model how to wrestle with stories and think about them and make them part of your life. And so that was always really, really key. And I think for me also, like, I came into the church partly through stories, because reading Flannery O'Connor's novels and Evelyn Waugh's novels, and something about those stories just sparked my imagination in a way that certain things clicked that had never clicked. Things like sacramental grace, or these, like, concepts that when you see them played out in the story, you're able to connect with them and they click in a different way. And of course, everybody's brain works differently, so that's not going to be everyone's story or, like, entrance into the church. But for me, that was just really transformative. And so I just always had a strong desire to share the sort of stories with my kids that would form their imagination and taste for beauty and truth and goodness. Because when we are formed that way, then I think it leaves us more open and desirous of, like, pursuing the source of beauty and truth and goodness, which is God. And so it's I think of it almost as like a preparation of their hearts for the gospel. And just something I really, really wanted to be intentional about offering to them.
Well, and how beautiful, like, I think of the parallels in just, like, those big life lessons coming in motherhood through storytelling and having those discussions. It's like, hello, parables. Jesus did the same thing with us. Like, that is something that is so needed, is just for our humanity and our human brains to latch on to, like, oh, this is the character and this is the thing, and here's the allegory of it all coming together. It's such a cool way to approach just teaching and conversations with your kids at all ages.
Absolutely. And I think we're just, as human beings, we are wired to learn through stories. When a priest is giving a homily, a lot of times he starts out telling a story. Then you're able to enter into it, and you're just able to understand it a different way, in a way that if someone just laid it out analytically, maybe it wouldn't have the same effect. Unless maybe you're a very analytical person, and that's the way it's going to connect. Like, one of my kids is incredibly analytical, and so he really, really likes that sort of thing. So everybody's different, but for me, stories were so crucial that was a huge priority.
So, okay, this is something, Haley, that I am always, like, as I am a new mom kind of entering into now, I'm starting to curate a little bit more of, like, what books we have in the house and what we're reading every night and those types of things. Tell me a little bit about maybe your philosophy in your parenthood journey about, do you curate books for your kids knowing the kind of conversations that are going to come out? Is it something that you're super intentional about, or is it something that you kind of let them lead the way as they grow up and then you have the conversations more organically as they come up?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that for me, I kind of thought about a couple of priorities. One is that I want my kids to love to read and it to feel like fun and not an assignment. And so with that, you have to have a little bit of flexibility in letting them make choices of what to read, and kind of determining, how do I balance them getting to pick with maybe not wanting them to read everything that they could find at the library, kind of thing. And I think part of that is curating, like, a home library where there's just books everywhere and they're just tripping over them and they're cluttering up the whole house, and there's so many to choose from, that they're having freedom there. Um, and in choosing what they're interested in at the time, what they want to read, and also that that's going to be really formative as to their taste for high quality literature and illustration and beauty, so that when inevitably they're exposed to more less high quality, just not great books, that they're not going to be as enticing, but they're going to want to read some of those. Like my kids have all had a Captain Underpants phase, and
You can't help it.
it's not my favorite, but I also don't want to say like, no, you can't read that unless I have a very good reason for that. Um, and so, yes, I think it's a combination of filling their environment with books so that this is a fun thing, and offering the really good stuff so that inevitably, when they want to pick up the less great stuff, it's really balanced out. And I've noticed that my oldest child, who, definitely he had the strongest Captain Underpants phase. I didn't know if it would ever end. It has ended. Um,
There
but
is light.
there's light at the end of the tunnel, people. Um, but I've noticed now he's very attuned to good storytelling and, beauty in a story. And a lot of times they'll say like, I try to stay on top as part of my job. I try to stay on top of the trends in children's books. And so sometimes I'll order some young adult fiction and have him pre-read it and tell me, which ones should I read that you thought were actually good. And his commentary is just hysterical, because he'll be like, this one made me feel like I was having a stroke. It was so, because he does have like a strong sense of the good stuff now. And so I think it's less, or my perspective is that it's less trying to shelter and protect from every potential less fantastic option, and more constantly and consistently offering the good options, because we only have so many years to shelter our kids, and then they're out in the world. And so I think what we can do best is to really try to help them form their taste for what's good and beautiful, because they're going to be discerning that on their own at some point. And if our the way we're navigating everything is just, no, you can't, no, you can't, no, you can't, eventually they can, and they have to be able to choose. So I think that's kind of my perspective is, within reason. There's certain things that I wouldn't want my kids to encounter, especially at a young age, but overall adding some freedom there and just continually offering the really good stuff.
I absolutely love that. And I'm so curious, Haley, especially because you work within Word on Fire, which are all the books that are put out are from amazing like Catholic worldviews. Like, you're going to get that with a book from Word on Fire. But obviously, Captain Underpants, not from a Catholic worldview at all. Plenty of books out there. I mean, I think of like, I have memories growing up of every night before bed, my dad would read us Little House on the Prairie. And that was like our bedtime book together. Not from a Catholic worldview, but like obviously a wonderful family book that kind of helped us understand storytelling. And like you said, put ourselves in the story. So for you, what's your barometer of like curating and what is good and true and great for your kids at certain ages? Like, how do you start to curate those things?
Sure. Well, I think if it's something that is going to diverge from a Catholic worldview, but is really, really high quality, has redemptive characteristics, it would spark a really great conversation, then I am all for that. I think if it's something that is intentionally written as kind of anti-Christian propaganda, even, like I'm thinking of something like Pullman's The Golden Compass series, where he apparently like read Chronicles of Narnia and thought like, well, I want to write a story that is, counter to Christian ideas and put it into a children's book. And so something about that, like, that rubs me the wrong way. I don't really want to read that to my kids. It's intended to be anti-Christian in some sense. So
Mhm.
like that to me like is a red flag. However, with an older child, with a older tween or teen, I think that could be a fruitful conversation, reading that together and kind of helping them read it with the skepticism, where they are able to see those ideas, like what message is being presented, how is that happening. I think that's a really important skill. And so a lot of times I will totally let my children engage with and interact with things that are not from a Catholic perspective, because if communication is open, you can discuss that. And I think it's such an important skill to develop this sense of how do you approach media, and
Mm.
what is being presented to you and what's trying to influence you, and kind of taking it from that perspective, not taking everything at face value. And that really requires, that's a skill that has to be developed. And so I don't want to send children off to college not having developed that at all, and not having kind of a healthy skepticism of what they're ingesting, be it good or bad. It should be viewed, should be approached with a little bit of skepticism.
Mhm.
What's being presented here, is that true? What's the message of this? And what do I want to take from it, and what do I want to leave behind? I think, as adults, that's a little bit easier. We can see a movie, we can read a book and say like, oh, well, I really liked this aspect of it. But if I looked closely at this other theme, no, I'm not going to agree with that. Or I think
Mhm.
it's warped in some way. And so I think that if we put our children in a bubble, then they never develop that. And I think that kind of sends them out into the world really vulnerable to any influence around them.
Yeah. And as your kids have started, your older kids, at least Haley, have started to get to this age where it's like middle school, high school, they're reading on their own. They're having a little bit more freedom in kind of what they're choosing to read from their libraries at school, from their friends' recommendations. How do you start as a parent to foster those conversations around maybe books or stories that you're not as familiar with when you see that they're reading them?
Yeah, I think, some parents do try to pre-read everything. I think if you have a big reader, it's like becomes impossible. So I do recommend a couple things. If you don't have time to read, there are resources you can look up just to get a feel for, what is this book about? What kind of themes are in it? I love following Sarah McKenzie. She has something called the Read Aloud Revival. She's Catholic. Her project is for anyone. But she really delves into a lot of new books and shares her perspective on them, so you kind of have a sense of what's great out there, maybe which things to tread carefully with and have a conversation about. But I think that it's helpful to kind of cultivate a family culture of talking about ideas. And so either whether it's around the dinner table or if it's in the car on the way to school, I think if you are modeling that this is part of what people do, they whatever they're reading or watching, they're kind of thinking about and sharing with other people and discussing it, then I think it's something that kind of naturally happens with your children. And I think, whether you're watching a movie and comparing it to the book, what did they change? Why did they make those changes? Do we like that better or not? Um, or just considering different characters and the choices they make. I think that starts to cultivate those kinds of conversations where
Mhm.
you're talking about the big ideas and kind of wrestling with them. And for that, you don't have to have characters who are always making the right choices. And I think that's something that I do see a lot as parents are understandably wanting to protect their children from negative influences. There's this sense that any character who does anything bad, that is then going to influence a child to do that bad thing. And I just completely disagree with that. That's essential to any kind of storytelling. There can't be a story if no one makes any bad choices. So that's one piece of it, but also what a perfect opportunity to discuss those choices. What should they have done? Was that the right choice? Do we understand what motivated them to do it, why they were tempted to do it. But what could they have done instead? What's being presented here? Is it being presented as a mistake, or is this author presenting this as acceptable? How can we tell? All of those things I think are really important conversations. I remember I had made a list on my blog ages ago of books that I thought that teenage girls should read. And one of them was Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. And I had an angry commenter tell me how, the character Marianne she's such a terrible role model for a teenage girl. And that's the point of the book. That's the point, is that you should not behave as she does and navigate the world as she does, and that you're watching her journey of maturity and transformation and seeing the person that she's meant to become and eventually does become, but also kind of the painful journey that she took to get there, which is just a little bit of a helpful red flag for young women reading the story. It helps them think, okay, do I want to be the Marianne in this situation? How can I avoid that? And so I think that that's key too, is we're not trying to keep our children from reading about bad choices. We're trying to cultivate in them a sense of right and wrong and wisdom and discernment and all of these things. And to do that, you do have to wrestle with vice as well as virtue.
Gosh, I think of how many stories of the saints start with some bad choices on the saints' part, and then look at the beauty in like the redemptive stories of so many of the saints.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also a sense of wanting to protect our children from anything dark, anything violent, anything distressing, which is, of course, every parent understands that inclination, because we don't want our children to have to deal with any of those things. But if we don't allow them to encounter those things in story, then we're really taking away a great place of practice for them in encountering those difficult things that they will encounter at some point in their lives. The world is a dark place. It is also full of many good things, but they're going to have to wrestle with the darkness and evil in the world. And how can they do that if we don't give them kind of this safe space to journey into that with these characters and imagine facing these things on their own and what that would look like? And I think it gives them courage and just makes them feel equipped in a different way if they've already encountered those things through story.
I think, Haley, the thing that comes to mind for me too is like, I've already been thinking so much about like first time mom. It's like, man, when we hit the point, how am I going to present, the crucifixion of Christ to my daughter? How am I going to present hell to my daughter? Like, these are things that are absolutely crucial for us to be teaching to our children because of the redemption on the other side of those things. But it is like, I have a little bit of my own, like, oh man, I wish I could just not tell her about those things until like she's older or like can understand more. But it's like, I know there's value in that. You wrote an article recently about this kind of in like the context of fairy tales, right? It's like, I remember growing up, we had this wonderful babysitter who was this older German lady who gave us a book of German fairy tales. And it was like the version that was as fresh of grim fairy tales as you could possibly be. And my mom was scandalized by these stories. She was like taking the book away from us because the non-Americanized version of these grim fairy tales are terrifying. Like, they are so scary. But I mean, I know, like you were saying, there is value in having those conversations through story with your kids from a younger age. So I guess in your experience, what age kind of are you starting to broach those conversations and allow the darkness of those fairy tales into the conversation with your kids, at least in your experience?
Yeah, I think that like 4 and 5 is kind of a good window for reading some of those fairy tales and encountering some of those spookier, scarier things. I think though it's so difficult to put an age range because every child is so different.
Mm-hmm.
So some of my children are more sensitive than others, and then I have friends whose children are incredibly sensitive to any kind of suspense, or they get very anxious. And so you have to, of course, everyone is going to know their own child. certainly better than I do by just slapping like an age range there. But for my kids, that's been kind of the age where they've been ready for those things. And I think that I was actually reading a fascinating book by a psychologist about fairy tales and young children. And his perspective was that we kind of dismiss the fears of children because
Mm.
we also don't want to think about things like death or violence, or we don't want to think about those things. And so when a child says, oh, like, mommy, what if you died, we just want to say, oh, that's not going to happen, mommy's not going to die. But the child knows that mommies sometimes die. It's
Mm.
real fear, and it's not unrealistic, although it's unlikely that they're going to lose us anytime soon. But there's like that's a real thing. And so if we don't offer a way for them to process that, we're really taking something valuable away from them and kind of dismissing their fear as not worth talking about because it makes us uncomfortable. And so I think that that is just really crucial to allow our children to process things like death or feeling unloved or abandonment, all of these things that are really scary to any person. Our kids feel scared about that too, and we have to let them process that in some way. And I think that fairy tales are a fantastic way to do that because they're also built into a worldview that's filled with hope. That there's this, the way that the world is built is with good conquering evil, which is what we believe if we believe the gospel. And so I think that's helpful to work through that in a fairy tale because ultimately good is going to win out. And so I think if we form our imaginations in that way, that's incredibly helpful in counteracting our culture's difficulties and struggles with despair and a
Mm.
sense of meaninglessness and living in a world of chaos in which one is just insignificant. And and so I think that offering them that different structure with which to understand what the universe is like and who they are in the universe is really, really important.
And I think of how cool and insightful it must be once your kids get to that age where they kind of start to like put themselves in the story and identify with certain characters, that you like get a little glimpse of like who they see themselves as or who they aspire to be or the types of characteristics that they think are like cool and worthy of aspiring to. It's just a cool little insight into their minds as they're forming.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's so fun, and it's just it's beautiful to see all at different ages because my teenager is very interested in like the ethics of different things. So like he wants to talk about these different
Cool.
moral dilemmas and like ethical situations that he's seeing in literature. Um, and then my youngest, I just started reading the Chronicles of Narnia to her a few months ago. And just watching her like little imagination open up and like be totally engaged with this. And she was drawing lions for like weeks after we read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And, Aslan was everywhere, and it was just so exciting. So I think that I anticipated that initial like introducing a child to these stories, but I didn't have a conception of how fun it would be to have a big kid who's still engaging with things that I love, whether it's, Charles Dickens or Jane Austen or, some of these more advanced stories and really diving into the morality and questions that they make us think of. Like all the stages are fun, like, so if for listeners with just little ones, it's so fun to have little ones and it keeps being fun.
My daughter right now is in a phase. I'm like, I think she's going to be a little reader, which is just like making my mom heart so happy. Her favorite thing to do right now, there could be toys all around her. She'll pick up a board book and just open it on her lap and just point to each page and then flip and point to each page and flip. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's so cute to see how they mirror what we do with them at that age with the books.
Absolutely. And that's showing that she's already getting some of that pre-literacy of like, I know what a book is for. I know how to
Yes.
turn the pages. I am watching this whole thing unfold. And that's just awesome.
It's so sweet. It's so cute to watch. Okay, Haley, I'd be remiss not to ask if you have any series or book recommendations that just like are mainstays in your house as your kiddos have grown up.
Sure. So, we also loved the Little House on the Prairie books. It is interesting reading them as an adult. You may have the same experience when you read them with your daughter. There are things that you notice that you maybe didn't remember as a child about just racism and different things that you're like, oh, I really didn't pick up on that as a kid, but
Hmm.
this might need some explanation. So I give that recommendation with the caveat that this should be used to have some conversations with your child about American history and how it's being presented in that story and why and whose perspective it's from. Um, just because the characters are kind of presented in such a rosy light that I think it's
Yes.
important to kind of come alongside the child and be like, Ma has some issues.
Yeah.
You know,
We got to
we
talk about Ma for a minute.
we love these things about Ma, but let's talk about how she's speaking about other kinds of people and the racial slurs that she's kind of using. Like we need to
Mhm.
discuss this. Like this is not okay. But let's
Yeah.
talk
Wow.
about this in context. So I am of the perspective that we shouldn't just cross books off of our list because they have problems, but instead use that as an opportunity to teach our children to read critically.
Mhm.
But yes, we've loved those. They're also great as audiobooks. We've listened to those on road trips. Lord of the Rings, we're huge Lord of the Rings fans, huge nerds over here. Chronicles of Narnia. Um, there's a few other series that we've liked a lot. One is the Penderwicks by Jeannie Birdsall. Another is the Mysterious Benedict Society. That one's a lot of fun. So they're kind of mystery books. There's several in the series. It's by Trenton Stewart, I think is his name. Trenton Lee Stewart, maybe. But we've loved those so much. And then the Anne of Green Gables series is just fabulous. So those are just a few of our favorites, but um, I feel like we're always encountering new ones that we love. One that I haven't read all of them. I think I've just read the first one, but my kids have loved is the Wing Feather Saga by Andrew
Mm.
Peterson. So those have been favorites as well. Um, and yes, so those are just a few, but there's so many good things out there.
Oh, I love it so much. I'm already excited to get to some of the. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's going to be so much fun to read, like the series that I remember growing up with, and then Anna Green Gables, the TV show. You gotta introduce that at some point too, I'm sure, to my kids. That was a mainstay in our house.
Absolutely. No, that the one from like the late 80s that
Yes.
yes,
Amazing.
perfection. No other
Oh,
will do for me.
I know. We got to stick with the classics, right? So okay, Haley, before we wrap up, I do want to ask, you have told me that you have a couple of things that you're working on, both yourself and kind of with Word of Fire. Can you just give us a little wrap up of kind of what's coming up in the world of Haley Stewart and World on Fire?
Absolutely. So I have a book coming out with Word on Fire in October. It's called The Catholic Kids Cookbook, Holy Days and Heavenly Food. So it's a project I co-authored with my friend Claire Sheaf, who's a photographer and just took gorgeous food photographs as we worked on all of these recipes and things. But really the idea behind the book is that it's an invitation into the liturgical year for the child. So just giving them a sense of the different seasons of the year and the significance of those seasons and just inviting them into the family traditions of the church, really. Um, and so that has been a lot of fun to create, and I can't wait to see it out in the world. I'm already having friends who have advanced copies send me like pictures of their kids cooking, and like it's
So cute.
so precious. So that is really exciting, and that um, I think you may be able to pre-order it from Amazon at this point, but it will be up on Word on Fire's website soon. But it'll be out in October, definitely in time for Christmas, if anybody is thinking about Christmas gifties. And then I'm writing the fourth in a children's series called the Sister Serafina Mysteries. They're about mouse nuns who run a little village school. Um, underneath the floorboards of G.K. Chesterton's house in Beaconsfield, England. And it is a lot of fun. So I'm writing book 4, but books 1 through 3 are already published through the Daughters of St. Paul. So those are also out in the world if anybody's looking for a new read for their little ones.
You had me at mouse nuns, Haley. I'm like, that sounds like the cutest thing ever. I don't care what age these books are for. I will be reading them. Thank you. I love it. And then, Haley, we always like to end with the same question that we ask all of our guests. Obviously, the point of this podcast is we're trying to just get our families to heaven, one little small thing at a time. So what is one thing that you are doing right now that's making your home a little bit more holy?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I was thinking on it earlier today. And I think that what I've been trying to focus on is just that strong connection with my children, that both like physical connection, emotional connection, that is making them feel loved and secure and able to have those kind of conversations about their faith, about things that they're questioning, things that they're thinking about, and just making home a place that feels very warm. And so kind of just that like sacred work of motherhood, which is maybe not like explicitly, it's not a prayer that you're speaking, but it's kind of a prayer that you're acting out, trying to create that environment in your home that's just the work of so many, little moments and conversations.
Oh, it's so important. It's so important. It's like the only thing that we can do. That and prayer. It's like that's it. That's all we can do to get them to heaven, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Haley, for joining us today. It was such a delight to talk to you, and I'm adding all of these series to my cart so that we can get those ready for when my daughter's a little bit older.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for having me. This was so much fun.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Creating Our Holy Home. This show is sponsored by Catholic home goods brand Our Holy Home, and we'd love to offer you 15% off your first order. So head over to ourholyhome.com and use the code podcast at checkout. For more sustainable practices and tips to get your family to heaven, subscribe to our email list at ourholyhome.com/subscribe. We'll be praying for you and your families this week, and we will be back very soon with more.